Hey everybody, I'm nutritionist Dr. Mike Russell, and welcome to this episode of the Dr. Mike Show. Today we're going to talk about science, we're going to talk about some really interesting research studies, and we're going to talk about a couple client case studies all around one key phrase that is essential to your progress and your success with your health, performance, or whatever the goals you're trying to achieve. This phrase is just keep going. Okay, let's talk about the phrase just keep going. As you can see, I have a sweatshirt. I had this specifically made just for myself with this phrase on it. I love this phrase, this concept. It's a total reminder, something I'm always telling myself. I really kind of got hooked on this idea, and this became a kind of a personal mantra of mine several years ago. It was in January. It was probably 5-6 years ago. And I was in South Dakota giving a couple talks, and I was able to kind of escape away from the place where I was giving the talks and go to Mount Rushmore. And if you go to Mount Rushmore in January, I can tell you there aren't very many people there. So I was able to spend some cool time at Mount Rushmore, walked around the gift shop, and found this book called Just Keep Going. And it was full of kind of tribal Native American stories around this concept of perseverance and just keep going. And the book was called Just Keep Going. I've posted about it on social a bunch of times. It's one of the most gifted books that I have, that I give out to people. I don't even have a copy here to show you because I actually gave away the copy that I have most recently. But when I was thinking about this concept and I was thinking about some ideas for the show, I thought, this concept of just keep going is so important to me, but what's the research? Is there any research to support this around nutrition and health? And what are some other examples that I can draw on to really emphasize the importance of this concept to you? Because me getting on and saying, hey, just keep going, it's so important, right, is interesting, but I don't think that's valuable to you. So I wanted to dig up and kind of find some additional evidence to support this idea. And it was really cool, the stuff that I found. So I'm really excited to share it with everyone today. So the first thing, and it literally just came to me, it was really interesting. Here I print off an abstract, and I'll link this up in the show notes. This visual abstract from the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA. They had a paper that was recently published about cardiology. And in this study, what they did was they looked at individuals. There were 9,000 individuals in this study. And so it was a multi-year study looking at intensive blood pressure control and how that reduced people's blood pressure and thus reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. But then what the researchers did was they followed those individuals again and checked back in with them on an average of 8.8 years later. So it was a 3-year study. And then they followed up almost 9 years later. So an additional, 7 years after the study was ending, to see what happened with those individuals with their blood pressure, also what happened with their risk of cardiovascular disease. And what they found was that most of these individuals, right, all their blood pressure returned and kept going up. Because as we get older, unfortunately, our arteries just get stiffer by default. And so that's why blood pressure increases with age. But that these individuals, not only did their blood pressure increase over time, but their risk of cardiovascular disease also significantly increased. And essentially at this 8.8 year mark, there was no evidence of that intensive blood pressure control that they experienced prior for, in 2 years. 2 years is a long time to maintain a change in your life. But what this really shows is that you can't just do something temporarily and expect to reap the benefits for your entire life. So we can't say, hey, I'm going to eat a low sodium diet. I'm going to eat lots of fruits and vegetables so I can maximize potassium and I can minimize sodium and I can improve my blood pressure. And I'm going to do that for a little bit. And then I'm going to go back to how I normally eat. Like, you can do that, but essentially the lowering your blood pressure and doing all that effort is a waste of time. And it really shows us physiologically that we need to just keep going. We need to stick with the plan. Like, the plan is the plan forever. And that's why it's so important that when we're looking at nutritional changes we want to make in our life, when we're looking at exercise and fitness habits that we want to change in our life, we need to find things that we're going to do on an ongoing basis. And we're going to do again and again and again. And now I think some people get this idea mistaken because they think that means they only can do things that they like. So they're going to say, well, I'm not a morning person, so I'm not going to wake up in the morning. It's just not something I'm going to do forever, so I'm not going to do it, right? That happens sometimes, but also change is uncomfortable. Like, you're going to instill and create new habits, and they're going to be uncomfortable. And they might not feel sustainable at first, but if you know that it's not necessarily an issue with your schedule or an issue with something else in your life, it's more just you don't like to get up early, that you can actually push through that and become a morning person. I have a friend who's literally just doing this, was never a morning person, was never really a morning exerciser, had a friend that always got up early and was like, you know what, I'm going to start joining you. And that accountability, essentially that person became his accountability partner. And he started getting up and he started training, and then it became his regimen, right? Now, this is very different than if you say, I'm never going to eat out because when I eat out, it's too many calories. And let's say you live in New York City where nobody cooks at their house, right? And so then you have to always cook at home, and there's a time issue, there's a cost issue, maybe there's a social issue, and it literally just doesn't jive with your life. So what you need to do is you need to develop a new strategy for how you can control your calories and your macronutrients and things like that. Early on in my career, I had a client who was in finance in New York City, and he wanted to get in shape for his wedding. And so he did this. He stopped going out, and he stopped going out at night, and he stopped having drinks and things like that. But that was literally a core part of his business. Was going out, meeting clients, having events, doing cocktail hours. And so his business took a huge hit during this time period, got in great shape, achieved the goal he wanted for his wedding, but his business took a really big hit. And so for him, this was not a sustainable change. And so one of the things we needed to work on was, well, where's the middle ground between the needing to go out and party with clients and have all these cocktail hours and out to eat and all this stuff versus never going out and just going and cooking at home and not having those experiences. Like, where's the middle ground? Like, how do we get out and how do we meet with the clients, but how do we control alcohol and thus calorie intake and just the kind of the overall food in those situations? Where's the middle ground in finding that? And that's what you need to figure out in order to just keep going. Because if you try to do something that's unsustainable, at some point you're going to say, well, this just isn't sustainable in my life. And then you revert back to the old. But what we learned from JAMA, if you revert back, you go back to how you were before. And this is going to transition us now to this other idea of, we've seen this revert back to old habits many, many times, but we don't necessarily recognize that for what it is. And this happens very much in body transformation contests. Now, I was, kind of indoctrinated into this idea of body transformation contests. I came up in the mid 90s in nutrition, and I was a teenager, and it was just so exciting and interesting, nutrition and weightlifting. And a big player at that time was EAS. And EAS, they had their own magazine, and they also, I won't say they pioneered body transformation contests, but they took it to a level that no company had before. And what you saw was all the success, but what you didn't see was all the people that reverted back to their old ways shortly afterwards. Because everybody can grit and bear it for 12 weeks, but it's like, what happens afterwards? And that's one of the things with the MetaShred diet. People say, well, what's the MetaShred diet? What's so different? The MetaShred diet's a diet book that I wrote several years ago. The MetaShred diet is a rapid weight loss diet, but where it is different than other diets and other approaches is it's the same core nutrition principles and the same core exercise principles that I'm always talking about on the show and I'm always writing about, but it's just intensified, and your commitment and consistency is just intensified to these things in a 28-day period so you can get better results faster. And now oftentimes in these body transformation contests, that's not the case, that people will go like just only on shakes and they'll go extreme calorie reduction and they'll start exercising 3-4 hours a day, something that they couldn't normally sustain in their life. And so what happens is you get great results, you get these amazing before and after pictures, but then week 13 comes along and you're like, oh, I'm going back to my old shtick here. And you can gain all the weight back, you lose the muscle, you fall out of those habits. And that really violates this whole idea of just keep going. So I had this friend, Matt Lisk, who did this. He was, I believe it actually even was EAS Body for Life transformation. And he had this amazing transformation. And then he, kind of like so many people, he regained the weight afterwards. And he actually ended up putting on a fair amount of weight. And so he was trying to figure out for himself, what did this work? How was this going to work for him? And what Matt ended up doing, because he traveled a lot for work and he found there was a lot of eating out and portion control was the biggest thing. And so he created what he dubbed the burrito diet, which sounds super gimmicky, but is actually a genuine effective strategy for him. And what he did was he bought these low carb tortilla wraps, and he would fill whatever food when he was in a hotel, or if he did to-go food, he would put it in the burrito. And if it didn't fit in the burrito, he wouldn't eat it. And so there was this built-in portion control for him for however many meals a day he did this. So he was all of a sudden, he was cutting down on his portions. It was something that worked in his life because he could bring these tortillas anywhere, right? Wherever he was traveling, they were easy to go to hotel rooms and things like that. He could eat the burritos when he was on the go. And so this is a great example of how he had adapted, kind of what he thought was the right strategy going through this body transformation contest, this like grit and bear it and do everything you can to reach this end goal. But then there was no planning on the other side. And so once he then came to the realization of, I need something long-term, because just like these people in this study, you need to be healthy 5 years from now, 8 years from now, not just 4, 6, 12 weeks from now. So Matt came up with this idea of the burrito diet, and he was able to lose, he lost like 100 pounds. And when you first hear this, you're like, oh, burrito diet, that sounds super gimmicky. But what he basically did was he said, how do I force portion control upon myself in a way that fits in my life? And it wasn't overly complicated, and it checked all the boxes for him, and it allowed him to just keep going. So that's really important. So when you're thinking about the strategies that you're developing for yourself and trying to put into action, do these work in your life, and do you need to tweak them a little bit to make them more custom to your own life? And that's something that I've always tried to work with people and say, like, how do we get this to work for you in your life? What's the perfect scenario? I always say, what's the best case scenario for you? How would this, in a perfect world, what would happen? And someone would lay that out, and then we say, okay, how do we get close to that? Maybe we can't achieve perfect world right now, but how do we start working towards that direction? Because if you can say, hey, this is my perfect world scenario, and you can come pretty close to achieving that, chances are that's something you're going to sustain for a long period of time. Now, kind of piggybacking on this idea of body transformation contests or going on diets, even something like the MetaShred diet, one thing that I remember, I was probably a first-year graduate student, had a small handful of people that I was supporting online with their nutrition programming, and I was had this client, she was making great progress. And one day during one of our check-ins, she said to me, well, when do I go back to eating the old way? I was like, well, you don't. This is the way. This is the normal. This is the new normal. Like, there's no going back to eating normal. If we revert back to eating what we would call quote unquote normal, then our body, our biomarkers, our health, all those things are then going to track back to that same place. So when we think about making these changes, and I think this is super important now as we're moving into January, when people start thinking about making all kinds of wild changes, we have to think about, what are these changes that I'm genuinely interested in? I'm not talking about dating your diet. I'm talking about marrying your diet. That's the marriage level of commitment. I have a marriage level of commitment to protein and vegetables at every meal, right? Because that's what I'm into. I'm not going to stray from that, because that's the commitment. Because I know if I'm committed to that, I'm getting myself 80% of the way there with my nutrition. So as you're thinking about your goals and the habits that you need to create in order to achieve those, what are the things that you can be married to, not just date? Dating doesn't get you there. We have to be married to our healthy habit changes. So now that we've looked at a couple of these examples of people and also a research study, the importance of just keep going. Sometimes it can be discouraging when you start because you're thinking, man, I have such a long way to go. Like, I understand the concept, like I got to keep going, but it seems like it's going to be so long until I get to the point where I feel good about my progress. And then it's more of this maintenance of my keep going. The good news is your body rewards you very quickly for making positive changes. And there are two specific ways where you reap these benefits. The first is insulin sensitivity, and the second is really exercise intensity. So let's talk about insulin sensitivity. Insulin sensitivity is how sensitive or aware is your body, the cells in your body, to the hormone insulin. So we'll kind of do a quick primer on this. You eat food, you eat a potato, right? That potato gets digested, goes into your digestive system. It's a starch, which is basically a string of sugar molecules. So when it gets digested, your body comes through, cuts it all up. And so you have these simple sugars that are in your bloodstream, right? Which is good because that's kind of the currency that your body likes. Your blood levels, right? Your blood glucose levels are going to go up. Now, your body likes to keep things in certain ranges, likes to keep the pH in a certain range, likes to keep blood sugar in a certain range. It has like this buffer, but it likes a range that it likes to keep it in. So when your blood sugar levels go up high, as they would because you just ate carbohydrates, this is a normal thing. Sometimes it gets sold online and in magazines and such as, this is terrible, your blood sugar rises. Like, if you eat carbohydrates or you eat sugar, like, your blood sugar is going to go up. Like, that's just how it works. But what next, the important thing is, what's the response? So what your body does is your body senses the rise in your blood sugar and it releases the hormone insulin. Insulin's job is basically to go around essentially knocking on doors, cellular doors, and saying, hey, let's get some of this sugar out of your bloodstream and into the cells, right? So that we can get our blood sugar back down to normal. Now, if we could, I don't know if it's appropriate to double analogy, but I'm going to double analogy. If any of you have kids and little kids, and you know that eventually you get numb to the sounds in your house, right? That kids can be running around, yelling, screaming, being loud. And after a while, you're like, man, it's not loud. It's just normal. And then someone comes to your house, right, who doesn't have kids, and they're like, oh my God, it's so loud in here. This is this sensitivity of sound. The same thing is on with insulin. So if your blood sugar levels are constantly high and your body's constantly then pumping out insulin, right? Insulin's walking around banging on these cellular doors like, hey, open up. We got to take some of this glucose. After a while, your cells just start ignoring insulin banging on the door. And so your body needs to pump out more insulin and then keep banging louder, louder, louder until eventually the cells say, okay, give me more glucose. But during that time, what happens is your blood sugar levels, your blood glucose levels continue to rise. Right? And so this is what we would call insulin resistance. Your cells become resistant to insulin's action of saying, hey, take this sugar out of your bloodstream. So you can do a variety of things to improve insulin resistance. Insulin resistance, many people think, is kind of like the foundational primary factor of cardiometabolic disease. That is where it all, kind of starts and then goes. Insulin resistance is the precursor to diabetes, so you could then argue it's also the precursor to metabolic syndrome, and also maybe potentially a variety of other conditions, specifically that big umbrella known as cardiovascular disease. But the cool thing about insulin resistance is if you are insulin resistant and then you go and do something, a positive action, like you go for a walk, you're going to get a bump in insulin sensitivity that's going to normalize your body's response. And now you might think, well, a walk is not much, but if you don't walk very much, right? If you're sedentary and then you go for a walk, that's a positive change. Your body rewards you for that. If you're a rather fit person who's very active and then you go for a walk, you're not really going to get much of a bump in your insulin sensitivity, right? But the good news about how the body responds specifically around insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. So insulin sensitivity is the opposite, that your cells then become much more receptive to insulin knocking on the doors. And exercise is a great way to do that. But the cool thing about your body is that your body recognizes small changes that are different from the normal. So if you are sitting there and you're like, look, I'm sedentary, I'm not very fit, I'm feeling a little anxious about starting because where I feel like I need to be is so far away, I'm never going to get there. Your body actually knows that. And your body's like, hey, that's cool. Let's do something small. Let's go for a walk after lunch. And if you do that, you're going to get rewarded with this really positive change in insulin sensitivity. So your body knows that you have to keep going, and it's going to reward you metabolically by taking small steps when you start. And we generally don't appreciate that when we're getting started because we're always looking at how far we have to travel. But your body says, that's cool. Let's just do something small, and you can reap those benefits from the small thing. The same thing is exercise intensity. And this is part of the reason why I like heart rate-based training so much. Because whether you think you have a high fitness level or whether you don't think you have a high fitness level, your heart rate tells the story. And so if you're not very fit and you go for a walk, maybe that's going to bump your heart rate up to 130, 140 beats per minute. But if you have spent a lot of time developing your fitness, you are very fit, you go for a walk, maybe your heart rate doesn't even get above 100, right? And that's okay because since you are fitter, your body is equipped, your muscles, your joints, your lungs, everything is equipped to work harder to reach those higher heart rate intensities. Whereas if you're just starting out, your body, you don't have the muscular endurance. Maybe you don't have, your joints aren't used to the constant movement, right? You're not ready to start breathing heavy to do lots of activity. But that's okay. You don't have to. You just do what you need to do to get your heart rate up. And that's going to be proportional to your own personal level of fitness. And I've run into this a bunch of times using heart rate monitors with clients. It's really rewarding because you can do a little bit of activity when you're just starting out and you can see the benefit. You're like, oh, I'm hitting these targets that I need to see. And then if you are a fitter person, you can use that to then work to hit those targets because you're actually going to need to work harder to get your heart rates up into those zones that you need to elicit the conditioning and the fitness effects that you want. So your body is really smart and it understands, I think, innately this idea that you have to just keep going. And in order to do that, you need to find small wins along the way. And so using heart rate-based training and the example of insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity and how responsive your body can be when you're just starting out versus not shows that it understands, let's get some small wins quickly, but then let's sustain this progress over time. So as we move into this New Year's resolution kind of season, and everybody's going to start setting new goals, some of them are probably going to be too aggressive. I say go for it. Research shows whether you set aggressive goals or you set not aggressive goals, your chance of achieving them are the same. So you might as well set aggressive goals, right? But then actually build a plan that sets you up for success and keep in the back of your mind, whatever I do, I need to just keep going. It's like the sweatshirt says, just keep going, because that is really how you're going to achieve what you truly want, which is long-term health, long-term performance, to really reap those benefits. It's no fun putting in a ton of work for 6 months, 12 months, reaping those benefits, and then all of a sudden see them slowly dissipate over the next 18 to 24. So commit yourself, just keep going, find the stuff that works in your life. Don't be afraid of discomfort. And remember, your body's set up to help you succeed here. So just lean into it. Everything's going to be great. That's going to wrap it up for this episode, guys, of the Dr. Mike Show. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. We have some really cool stuff coming up. An optimal performance challenge we're going to be running the first of the year to help you stack some of these healthy habits. If you haven't already, head over to substancenutrition.com and try our newest protein, Authentic Vanilla. The protein powder is called Synthesis. It's a mix of premium, fast, and slow-acting proteins, whey protein isolate, and also micellar casein. We were recently certified Informed Choice Sport, which means it's been third-party tested and verified to be free of over 250 banned substances. So you know, and you can feel really good for you and your family that whatever's on the label, that's what's in the bag of protein. So head over to substancenutrition.com and check that out, and we'll see you guys next week.